Hi, Dan from Eflowtion Support Services here, and welcome to this little chat on being misdiagnosed and what that's like to experience. I was misdiagnosed with Schizoaffective Disorder, which turned out to be CPTSD, and Absence Seizures, which turned out to be dissociation, which was checked by a psychiatrist and a neurologist with EEGs, so I was given the all clear on that. But what is it like to actually be misdiagnosed? To talk about being diagnosed, I have to kind of put it in a metaphor to explain it. When you are working, for example, and there might be a social gathering, and someone might say, well, what do you do for a living? You say, I'm a software engineer. And that's what I do for a living. And I did talk about this in a video, and I was sort of tongue-in-cheek sort of saying that, you know, if you change your job titles or if you lose your job, do you get reborn into another life, or is it a loss of life because you've lost your job, or you're reborn because you've changed your job titles, so now you're doing a different life? But the point that I was making in that video is how we identify to our job titles and how we have to perform in that job title is similar to diagnoses. We get our diagnosis, we're told our list of symptoms and the medications or whatever treatment that we receive, and that sort of is that little, you know, hi, I'm this label sort of thing. And there's normally, depending on the type of diagnosis, like schizophrenia, for example, because it's painted so lovingly in the movies and all that, there's going to be a fear or a stigma around that, which, you know, you're already had probably adversity in your life, and now you're facing the adversity of what others might think of you, and also what you think of yourself with this diagnosis. That identification with what we're diagnosed with, that label, in a way, almost starts to, depending upon the person, can either confine the person in the form of like, well, you know, I can't do this because like people will think I'm a freak because I have this diagnosis. For other people it might be like, well, I have this diagnosis now, I can better understand myself and how to live my life even more better. So it's not always a life sentence when you're given a diagnosis, but sometimes these diagnoses just go for life. The treatment, the medications can go for life with no sort of hope for a reprieve or a form of different sort of outcomes to something. Definitely in with the absence seizures, I was told by the family GP that she could give me 100 reasons why I'd never come off the medication. I provide the 101 reasons, which was a neurology assessment saying that I never had the absence seizures, it was dissociation. I talked about how we identify with things, how other people perceive you, how you've been narrating your life as this, in my case, a schizoaffective sort of thing, the voices, all these sorts of things. So how you know yourself and how people know you is of this label. So in a way, I mean, I was tongue-in-cheek, but it is kind of a reborn in the sense of you now have this new diagnosis of CPTSD, and that's about that. How I know myself, it's a big shift in understanding of oneself. It's kind of an identity loss in a way, and there is grieving in that. Like how you knew yourself, how you function, wasn't what you were led to believe. There is mistrust, of course, that comes in the medical system. There's anger that is definitely comes from that. And I think all of these feelings are valid. It's with all these emotions, it's what you do with it and what you're prepared to actually do to instigate change on that. Are you wanting to go against the whole medical system to implement change on something? I mean, as much as my psychiatrist got it wrong in the first time, I would tip my hat to him to admit that he got it wrong, that, you know, he misdiagnosed me, that he re-diagnosed me. Otherwise, I'd still be carrying that diagnosis. It took the neurologist, a brand new neurologist, to actually retest me. So there is an admittance of we screwed up, and I'm sure it happens in other aspects like surgeries and everything like that. Sometimes the saying of what doctors know best, it's the understanding of doctors were trained in a specific set of knowledge and skills and applied that in a practical way to get their doctorate in something. So what they know is what they've been trained in. For example, if you're feeling low and down and you go to your doctor and you get given a test to test to see if you have depression, is it the test or is it the actual person's family environment or the environment they're brought up in? How much time are they willing to spend before that label is put on? There is the Adverse Child Experiences, the ACEs test, to actually look at a diagnosis of trauma. Is that test getting pulled out? Is the only form of psychological care talk therapy? Because sometimes talking about a trauma can re-traumatize a trauma, and if that's the case, what are we doing to actually release that trauma? But another way to look at it is, like, especially with trauma, if you look at a memory is a past event that is already happened, but it feels very real when it's relived in the body, but it's not actually visibly happening around us. It's kind of like if you want to put it in terms of like an energetic charge that's in the body, it's charging us to either fight something, run away from something, and if we suppress it for too long or depress it sort of thing, we can feel worn out, tired, exhausted, flat, because it's a lot to carry for a person for a long time. And if you can identify that but not attach to it, like, okay, this experience happened to me, how can I now start to discharge this feeling? And sometimes it is something as simple as moving the body or getting something where we're not in that thinking state. So that's where, even in a cognitive based therapy, when you're starting to talk about something, you start getting tense sort of thing, because it's like your body is now reliving that memory. It's how do we start to get that out of the body? How do we shake it out of the body? How do we tap it out of the body? How do we EMDR it out of the body? All these sorts of things where we can start processing the trauma. And I think it goes back to what I was sort of saying, is a set and forget of you've got this diagnosis and now we're going to just have a big old chat about your past history, or is it starting to release that history from the body, because trauma stores in the body. So being able to release the trauma, and for some people there's a lot of trauma, and even for some people small amounts of trauma is a big trauma. It's really how it is interpreted by the personal experience of a person. That's why EFT, it's like I can't give a timeline, because it comes down to the person sort of thing. It could be just the very tip of the iceberg that we thought our addiction to coffee might be a little bit more sort of thing. What is driving that addiction? It's where we can actually start to release that charge and not getting identified to the narrative of that charge. Because if we start to get identified to the narrative of that charge, we start to relive that charge. If we come across a crappy psychologist or just a psychologist we just can't connect to, we start to have to relive that charge again. So it is looking at how can we effectively down-regulate the nervous system, so even when we start to tell that story, it doesn't have the same intensity behind it. It becomes a part of our experience rather than disabling our current experience, because we have all of this built up, things where we're seeing the world through the eyes of the danger that we were put under. So we see everything as a threat. But the other thing is, coming off medication altogether doesn't mean that all life is rose-colored glasses and green trees and love and light sort of thing. It means that you're now dealing with whatever you're dealing with without the medication. So it's also knowing what trauma treatments will help down-regulate, what will release that from the body, because otherwise it's just going to be the effects of the trauma without kind of that blanketing effect of the medication. Once again, it's not an easy thing just to go, well, I've had my diagnosis change, everything's great now. It's just I've had my diagnosis change, and now I have an awareness of what I have to deal with now. I can better deal with that now, rather than just going, the change of diagnosis meant that I was cured. Because the effects of the trauma are still going to be in there and need to be released through probably a treatment that is more effective to oneself. So it's not an easy thing to be re-diagnosed, both in how we identify ourselves, how we receive our treatment. If we've got no medication at all, for myself, I don't smoke or drink or anything like that. Those are just choices that I made. So I'm not self-soothing myself through alcohol. Like, I've not gone from one medication to self-medicating. I face all of that just through the tools that I've been taught. So any change of diagnosis brings about a whole shift in oneself. And the other thing is, once you start to heal yourself, how people identified you as that. There might be life changes that happen to you. There might be how you perceive things, how you are dependent upon things and people, and how you, even job titles, what brought you satisfaction, what was a coping mechanism, might start to drop away, and might just start to no longer be part of your identity, and how you were coping in a way, and how others were happy with you staying within that role and wanting to convince you that you're crazy, sort of thing. So not only is it a loss of identity in a way, it might be a loss of people around you that were quite happy for you to be within that identity role of having a diagnosis. So sometimes a healing journey is a grieving journey, in the sense of grieving what happened to us, grieving the loss of people that enabled that, and grieving the loss of how we perceived ourselves. And with any grief cycle, there is a long journey of emotions that don't go on a linear scale. So that's probably why it's also good to have an awareness that not to attach too heavily to one emotion, and how do we release it, and how do we bring ourselves knowledge and wisdom from each experience that we encounter, so hopefully we can not re-enter something like that again. I'm Dion from Eflowtion Support Services. Thank you to everyone that has subscribed, has commented, has supported one another. It's like, I look in the comments and I try to comment as much as I can, but I'm seeing like-minded people with similar experiences connecting with each other, and like I spoke about, like kindness being one of the things that was, can be used for traumatizing a person. And I also said that love can hurt and love can heal. And going beyond oneself to actually care for another person that has been in a similar experience, I think a community can connect together to help each other. And I'm not talking about like giving each other therapy or anything like that. I'm just sort of saying holding a space for people. It tends to be like the poorer demographic will be the ones that will donate to people who are struggling, rather than the richer demographics. And I think that's because we know struggle, and we know what it's like to go through struggle, and I don't think we want other people to struggle. So thank you for connecting and giving your words to me and to others, and I'll end it there. So I'll catch you in the next chat and the next tap. So thank you for connecting. Bye for now.